Welcome to the Alpha Prime tutorial. We're going to be talking about the daily, weekly, and monthly pivots. One of my favorite indicators out there because it has such a high potential hit rate if you use it in the right way. So basically, what is a pivot? Well, we're often familiar with the pivots that everyone talks about, which, as you can see on this chart, are these peaks here. There's a pivot, and there's a pivot. But the pivots we're going to be talking about are slightly different. These weekly, daily, and monthly pivots give a bit of a range of where the average highs, lows, and also average price sits on a daily, weekly, and monthly range. These can be so significant because they can act like a magnet to price. Now, this isn't always the case with really any indicator. Some are proven to be much stronger than others, and the weekly pivot, which I talk about specifically, does just that. Now let's take a look at the weekly pivot and the settings on the Alpha Prime. As always, head on up to the settings by clicking on the little cog just here, and then scroll on down until you get to the weekly pivot menu. Now, I tend to refer to these a lot as weekly pivots because that's what the default is, and also I find that is one of the strongest and most frequent pivots to use, and it's also the Alpha Prime default. So first of all, we want to make sure we can see the weekly pivot, and simply select this box here, and it will turn it on or off. Next up, we have the box which is Hide Historical Weekly Pivots. Now, I find this incredibly useful to leave off so that you can actually see them. So if we turn that off, then you'll see all of the historical weekly pivots pop up. Now, this is very important if you're doing one of the trading strategies that I use, which is the price will almost always fill an untested weekly pivot, which we'll take a look at in some historical data pretty soon. But if we scroll out, then we can see all of the weekly pivots that are sitting here. And then last but not least, we have the Show Future Pivot. This is quite an interesting tool and a little bit speculative, but it gets stronger as the week goes on. Now, just as a bit of a confirmation here, the daily pivot constitutes from 1 minute past midnight all the way up to 11:59 p.m. And then the weekly pivot constitutes from Monday all the way up to Sunday. And lastly, the monthly constitutes as the first to the last day of the month. Well, what does the future pivot do? It gives you a bit of a snapshot of what and where the pivot is going to be. In the first hour of the day, the first day of the week, and also the first day of the month, it's not going to be that useful. However, as we move more towards the end of the day, the end of the week, and the end of the month, we get a really good gauge on where the pivot is going to end up. And this is what it'll look like. When the pivot prints, you'll see this little green box just here, or purple box if it ends up being bearish. Now, how do you change it from daily, weekly to monthly? Very easily. Just head on over to monthly pivot resolution, change it from D, which is daily, W, which is weekly, and M, which is monthly. No surprise there. And as we can see on the daily, we obviously have a whole lot more, and on the monthly, we have a whole lot less. Of course, have a play around with these different settings, and they are more applicable to different timeframes. When you're looking at daily and weekly timeframes, then the monthly pivot is going to be much more effective. But if you're on much lower timeframes, then you want to be looking at the daily pivot. And I'm talking around about your 5, 10, 15 minute timeframes here. But for the purpose of this, we'll keep it on weekly, just because weekly is the best. And they are pretty much all the settings that you are ever going to need for the weekly pivot. Let's take a look at how to trade this. So here we are at the start of a new week, and we're going to try and play this through as if we were trading it in real life. So as we move on, we see that a new weekly pivot has formed just here. Let's get a bit closer so you can see that. And right now the price is quite far above it. And we know that over the past week, this has been pretty much the central area for where the price should probably swing around. Now let's look at setting up a trade. So as we see that the weekly pivot is below us, we can expect that the price is either going to at least test it or maybe even fill the entire thing. So we'll set our trade accordingly. Here we have our entry point, which is wherever we choose to put it. We could try and be a little bit leaner, but for the sake of this, I'm going to do it on the current price. Then I'm going to do my max profit, which will be all the way down here, which is taking me to 3.24%. And also I'm going to put in a couple of take profits as well. My first one is going to be at the very first part of the weekly pivot, which in this case would be the average of the weekly high. Then I'm going to do the average price just here, and then finally the top price, which is going to be filling up the entire weekly pivot, which gives me 3 nice coordinated take profits. And we'll just set our take profit or stop loss accordingly. So we have a 1.42% TP on the first take profit. So we'll make sure that we at least don't exceed that too much and put around about a 1-to-1 risk reward on the first TP. And we will see how this goes. And there we go. It is pretty much filled instantly. You don't have to enter on the very first hour of the day, the very first day of the week, or the very first day of the month. You can be pretty lean with it. So for instance, we could have actually had a buy here, and we could have also had a buy here, just in case the price spiked up. And again, because we know that the weekly pivot has such a high chance of getting filled, we can use that in our favor and maybe pick up some better entries. And there we go, a quick crash course on how to trade weekly pivots and also how to set them up using the Alpha Prime.